Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. My name is Terry McVenas, the President and CEO of RTCA. Greetings and welcome to all of you to what is now our 25th in a series of webinars, Aviation Technology Connect. We're pleased to have created this series via this platform to hear from a variety of aviation industry leaders on a broad spectrum of topics, which will educate you, further inspire you in your profession, and perhaps even evolve your thinking as to where the industry is today and where it's going in the future. As in the past, we have a great international audience with us today, so welcome to all of you joining us from the United States, Canada, and across the globe, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. As a note, this webinar is being recorded as all of our other previous webinars have been, so if you want to go back and listen to any of our previous webinars, you can find those recordings on the RTCA YouTube channel. Now, I know many of you watching today are familiar with RTCA, but I do know we have some first-time visitors with us. So I want to take just a couple of minutes to familiarize you with who we are. RTCA is an aviation-centered standards development organization whose mission is to inspire the creation and the implementation of integrated performance standards that meet the changing global aviation environment and further ensure the safety, security, and the overall health of the aviation ecosystem. Now, in addition to developing standards, we also provide training to government and to industry personnel on the application of those standards in developing the basis for certification and testing. And on the screen, you can see a few of our upcoming training courses that we have in June. Training on DO-178C, which is the software considerations for airborne systems equipment and certification. That's going to be held on June 5th through the 8th. And also that week, our newest course, Human Factors in the Certification Process, will be held June 6th through the 8th. And then on June 26th through the 29th, we'll be holding our Airworthiness Security Certification course. So you can sign up for any of those courses via our website at www.rtca.org. Now, if you're interested or you have any questions about our training, our standards development work, or interested in becoming a part of the RTCA family of members so that you can have a voice in developing standards, you can contact us directly through our website or via telephone. Our ability to bring you these webinars would not be possible without the generous support from our industry partners. And today I'm especially thankful to Collins Aerospace and the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, who are gold sponsors for this year's series of webinars, and to the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, GAMA, who's also a sponsor of today's webinar. Now, as we get into the discussion today, you're going to have the opportunity to weigh in with your questions to the panelists. So simply just use the Q&A tab on the webinar platform to communicate with us and get those questions to the panelists. So let's get started. We've been hearing a lot in the news of late about advanced air mobility, or AAM. Now, the concepts of AAM have truly become a reflection of aviation's continuing evolution and represents the next inflection point of change in our industry. At RTCA, we've been putting a lot of energy into this topic this year. We've held 2 AAM workshops in our offices with industry stakeholders and regulators. And last month, we kicked off a series of 3 webinars on this topic of AAM. In last month's webinar, we had a fabulous discussion with some of the industry's top experts from the AAM community, where we talked about the market evolution of AAM and how the different operational modes affect design, some of the avionics choices, approvals, and certification, plus some of the challenges that the industry is facing in moving from design approvals to operational approval. And today, in part 2 of this 3-part series, we're going to focus on safety and security with some of the near-term tactics and some of the longer-term considerations that are going to be essential for a successful integration of the various concepts of operations that are being proposed. I'm pleased to have join me today another set of industry top experts in the AAM industry, representing AUVSI, Reliable Robotics, and the Transportation Security Administration. And moderating today's panel is a great friend of RTCA, Mr. Tom Ferrell, who's the interim head of software development assurance at Joby Aviation, which is one of several roles that Tom has at Joby. a long history of leading and working on several of our special committees over the years. Tom is also a member of our TCA's advisory board. So Tom, welcome, and I'll toss things over to you for the introduction of your fellow panelists and to get the discussion going.
Thanks, Terry. Glad to be here today. As Terry mentioned, I am currently with Joby Aviation. For the last year, I've been heading up the software team there, as well as still doing what I was originally hired for, which is to lead the development assurance area and the FADERs associated with software and airborne electronic hardware compliance. Next slide. So just a little bit about Joby. I suspect many of you have heard about us. We've been in the news a little bit, along with many of our other competitors who are vying for a place in the new AAM environment. We've been working for a little over a decade on an electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, which we intend to own and operate as a air taxi service around the world. So with that short introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Mike Rucinski from the TSA for his intro.
Hello, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Rucinski. I am the Industry Engagement Manager for General Aviation with the Transportation Security Administration. I also co-chair the General Aviation Subcommittee of the Aviation Security Advisory Committee. Within that group, we have an Advanced Air Mobility Working Group. I co-chair that with industry, where we work with industry OEMs, operators, airports, vertiports, various partners to look forward to advancing the AAM and advancing and securing the AAM industry. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And next over to Juerg Frefel from Reliable Robotics.
Good morning. My name is, I'm happy to be here at this panel. My name is Juerg Frefel. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Reliable Robotics. Next slide. Reliable Robotics, we're developing a platform-agnostic remote piloted aircraft system that initially gets deployed on the popular 208 Caravan aircraft in a feeder cargo operation, operating for logistics company like FedEx and the like. The system can be deployed on other aircrafts, and we plan on doing this after the Caravan in the civilian and then the defense side. Next slide. Our system contains both the airborne portion of the aircraft that is required to fly fully remote pilot and autonomous, has the detect and avoid system on board. The system also includes a communications link to a ground station and a remote piloting center where the pilots from the ground manage and operate the flight. The system also contains the necessary ground infrastructure to communicate with the aircraft and with the various operation centers. We have flown our system on a 172 in an unmanned fashion on an FAA waiver in 2019, and then have submitted our PSCP with the FAA for our autonomy system in 2019, and that is a current active project with the FAA to get this certified and work out the intricate details on how the certification of autonomy system works. I'm happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Juerg. And finally, our last panelist, Brian Wynne from AUVSI.
Thank you, Tom. It's great to be here with everybody. I'm Brian Wynne. I'm president and CEO of the Association for Uncrewed Vehicle Systems International. An organization which just celebrated its 50th year since being founded in 1972. And we, as an organization, started out on the military side of the house, and now and focused predominantly on the air. We have embraced all of the different domains for uncrewed and robotics, so the ground domain and the maritime domain as well. And increasingly now we're working in the cyber domain, which arguably is its own domain, but also supports all of the other three. A theme for our organization this year is, and we're about to release a very important document called Blueprint for Autonomy. So autonomy, we think, is an ideal that we're working toward, and I'll be saying a little bit more about that during the discussion. Really delighted to be here.
Excellent. Welcome. Really good panel here today. So I'd like to get us started. Our topics for today are safety and security, and we will tackle the safety piece of this first. And I think where I'd like to steer the conversation is in the direction of operational safety. So for the next few minutes, I'd like each of the panelists to talk a little bit about what they see as the biggest challenges facing the industry as a whole, both legacy and newcomers, to be able to work together for NAS integration to ensure that we both maintain and hopefully improve overall operational safety going forward. Juerg, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I'm glad to start off here. So first thing, I want to acknowledge that we're on a fixed wing aircraft. So a lot of existing standard from an airworthiness side in regards to safety are well applicable. Like the standards like 4754 and 4761 are well established and work well for our application. We're using the standard 254-178 framework that has been established to ensure hardware to be robust, testing to the 160 piece. So I felt like we as a moving into this autonomy space or this AAM space are standing on top of giants and a large history and legacy of safety standards that have served the industry well from an airworthiness standpoint. So as you mentioned, the next part is then how do we get the operational safety understood? The approach we have taken there is actually, we understand quickly that it's not just the airworthiness piece, but the also airline operation that needs to happen. So what Reliable has done, the approach we're taking is we have stood up an airline that lets us work with the FAA and the FISTO through the OpSpec and how we ensure the operational safety and how that works on that side. Yeah, let me end it at this point and make sure I don't hog off the space here.
Oh, no worries. Mike, I know we're starting on the safety side and you're maybe more focused on security. Anything that you'd like to talk about from the operational safety perspective?
Certainly, as you mentioned, TSA focuses on the security aspect of most aviation operations. We leave safety largely to our partners at the FAA. That said, there can be overlap between safety and security. There can be issues, again, at the airport or now vertiport level that may combine some safety and security issues. On board the aircraft, there may be similar safety security overlap with cockpit security, for example. The build of the aircraft and cockpit security certification would fall with FAA, but certainly there's security aspects behind that. You also have safety and security overlap with certain airspace issues. National security special events and airspace over the airspace control, temporary flight restrictions that may have a security nexus, but yet are run by FAA from the air traffic control aspect. So there is a nexus there sometimes between safety and security. But as you mentioned, I'll have more to say once we hit the security topic. But thank you.
All right, fair enough. Brian.
Yeah, I really admire Juerg. You talked about a lot of different things. When I'm talking, there'll be a complete lack of numbers and letters and things that refer to standards. It's really hard to pick what the biggest challenge is that we're dealing with. I think knowing what I know about the people on this call and on this panel, and probably the people watching, if there weren't challenges, we probably wouldn't be doing this. But I would sort of pick out in a very atmospheric way the notion that somehow because something is new and we have a lot of really interesting new approaches to aviation, that it's somehow potentially threatening to safety. When we know that technology, if properly executed and inside the bounds of the very, very successful regulatory system we operate within, can actually enhance safety. And we've been enhancing safety since the beginning of aviation. I've been an aviator for 30 years, just a low and slow guy, but I own my own aircraft. I fly, instrument, single pilot IFR. my goodness, the tools that we have today that thanks to a whole bunch of things, but technology, microprocessor speeds improving and speeding up, more elegant software. And now we see other elements that have been happening. My previous job was electric drive on the ground, coming into aviation, redundancy in systems and so forth and so on, and just the reliability of electric motors in general terms. I mean, the way these things are coming together, if we execute this right, and as an industry, we're dedicated to executing it right, this will improve safety. It will enhance this. And we're always on this, I would say, on a continuum of automation throughout the aviation history. So this is a challenge that I think we need to overcome. From the very beginning, when I got involved in this particular effort in 2015, there have been people obviously that have been around it a lot longer than I have. The effort has been to figure out how can we improve safety? How can we make the airspace safer for all? I have a couple of really selfish things that I'd like to see. I'd like to not rely on see and avoid. It's never been really good, even when my eyesight was a lot better than it is today. And imagine what we can do just with small UAS alone to scale that out, make it affordable, make it reliable in an operational context. So kind of getting beyond this, this overall context of we're challenging safety rather than working toward a safer system, I think is what I would identify, at least today.
I really appreciate that, and I'll add a couple thoughts on that particular theme. A lot of people look at Joby and our various competitors who are vying in this space, and they say, "Oh, you want to lower the bar. You want to come in and do things that other people had to fight their way through, and you just think you can get it for free." And that is absolutely not the case. Just as Juerg mentioned, we have set up a full Part 135 operation within the company. We are proving out our capability to operate under those rules using a Cirrus SR-22, I believe. It will be the death knell to the industry for anyone to come into this space and immediately, lose an aircraft and hurt people either on board or on the ground because they did not pay attention to the fundamentals of safety. That just becomes the foundation for everything that we do, and we move from there and grow from there. So as you noted, things like faster processor speeds, more capable computing equipment, more advanced concepts that rely on significant levels of redundancy, and just the fact that when you are working with an electric vehicle where you may run out of adequate battery power to drive propulsion, you still will generally have enough battery power for control surfaces and to provide inputs to the pilot in such a way you can still safely get the aircraft down to the ground. There's just a lot of capabilities in this new technology that we haven't had before. So let's go ahead and move on to question 2. Yeah,
Tom,
please.
do you mind if I could add one more item on that?
Yep.
I wanted to bring out that I actually see automation increasing the safety as well in the aircraft. If you look at the number 1 and number 2 causes for small aircraft, it's control flight into terrain and loss in control. Those are key items that autonomy can solve, or automation in aircraft can solve. We can eliminate those 2 main causes of accidents in small aircraft.
Yep, absolutely agree. We spend an awful lot of time focused on envelope protection for that very purpose. We can do things with the capabilities on these airplanes that were just unheard of a few years ago. Juerg, I'd like to stay with you on this concept of safety. Your company occupies an interesting space from the standpoint that your focus is retrofitting existing aircraft to make use of autonomous flight to accomplish a lot of different missions. Would you like to share with the folks here some of the challenges that you are running into in trying to work in that particular space where you're retrofitting equipment?
So maybe the first piece on that side, I want to actually acknowledge how well things are working out for us, because we're retrofitting into an existing well-established airframe that has been proven out for many, many years. All the bugs and kinks have been worked out. It's been certified. It's been flown at scale. And the FAA has actually a well-established process for STCs on aircraft. And we're using the normal STC process. So this is a normal category aircraft. We're a Part 23 STC process. So we're not relying on a special 2117. Do I get my numbers right? 2117 rules for new introductions. So we're relying on existing framework to do this. The main challenges there is initially people were not clear if an autonomy system could actually be added on via an STC, but we have worked with the FAA and be able to show that the aircraft is well understood, is a simple aircraft that you can look at, is well understood by the regulators, well understood by the industry, and gotten to the place that the actual STC process that is laid out, like supplemental type certificate process that is laid out, is applicable for an autonomy system like ours, and to bring up the capability of this aircraft. So that has been a big relief for us that this process is actually working as we expected it to do. The challenges we have is there's the normal challenges. It's an older airframe. We'll work you through the, regulation have changed over time, and we're adapting to that. But even there, the FAA is actually well versed on how to do this. Where things become interesting from a safety standpoint is our system is actually large. It's a full aircraft automation system. In order to ensure it's actually safe, we had to rederive the aircraft safety from the top. You cannot just make a local modification and show the local modification is safe. But we rederive the whole aircraft level function, the criticality, and the hazards that are each allocated to each function to then ensure that the aircraft is safe with all the new systems going on. It was a lot of work. It was necessary work. And I'm happy to see that the existing standards are actually helped us to be able to structure that, leaning back on the 4754 and 61 standards. The challenges we have is managing any functions that is currently allocated to the pilot. A pilot is making decisions. How do we bring piloted functions into system functions? We have a good framework in place and working through that, but that is definitely a new and novel approach that we tackling there. Back to you, Tom.
If I might, with a quick follow on, the automating pilot functions, I know have been a significant discussion within the ASTM community, another standards body like RTCA. And there's always been this question of kind of the piece that the pilot brings that isn't really captured at any given standard, that human intuition. Anything you might want to comment on how you've tried to target that particular piece of the puzzle?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like the unknown unknowns. How do we know what the pilot knows, and how do we structure that? So we have established a comprehensive process internally to the company on how we actually evaluate what the pilot is doing, what information the pilot has available, how decisions are getting made, and how the safety of the aircraft is affected. Similar here, we're leaning on industry as well. The S18 committee on the SAE side has worked a lot of that gap analysis on the 4761 and 4754 standard for unmanned system. One of our employees actually chairing one of their committees, and that has helped us to be able to uncover some of those gaps and bring this back to the industry of what the process should be for any remote piloted autonomous system, on how we uncover those gaps that largely show up at the boundary between what the person does and what the system does.
Interesting. Brian, I suspect with all the various members within your organization, you're actually seeing a fair number of companies that are tackling that aspect of automation. Since you're working from small UASs all the way up to much larger scale autonomous craft going down the things that people are looking to do in the future. Would you like to comment on what you see as the kind of the readiness of both the FAA and EASA to kind of take on these challenges and be prepared to have discussions of what does it mean when the pilot in charge is automation and not flesh and blood?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different ways that I would want to try and answer that question, but I'm going to start with the way that, this organization that I have the good fortune to work for, and the members of the organization approach this is a global phenomenon. This technology is there are market signals everywhere. They're around the globe as to how we can apply greater and greater automation in the aviation world and in other domains as well. And obviously it's going to land. I'll stick with my my aviation analogies here. It's going to land differently in different markets. But I think the key thing here, and one of the important roles of an RTCA and an AUVSI and other organizations, including the traditional aviation organizations, is to make sure that the industry itself is first and foremost talking about how it can package ideas in a way that's helpful to our regulators and to our policymakers. I recently was in Europe, and I won't identify the different folks that I talked with, but I asked them a very simple question, which was, how are you interfacing with industry? That's a very different process in Europe than it is in the United States. And I won't say it's better or worse. I'll just say it's different, and it's important for us as a community of interest, technology interests, commercial interests, et cetera, to be clear on what it is that we want to try and move forward with, even though we may approach the regulators in Europe differently than we approach the FAA here in the U.S. And elsewhere. We participate in the ARPAS panel at ICAO, et cetera, with the same objective of trying to make sure that we're learning from each other and that we're moving forward with the greatest support from industry possible. Because nobody thinks that safety is a competitive process, right? Safety is immutable in the aviation world. It goes without saying. And security, which I know we're going to get to here as well. Same thing. We have to be very, very clear on what our objectives are and recognize that not only do the regulators and the policymakers come at this from different points of view because of their regulatory history in the US and Europe, but also that, this is in many instances what we're trying to achieve here has implications well beyond aviation safety. And even the FAA is trying to figure out ways to engage their partners in the security area. I know Mike is going to speak to this because the things that we're talking about challenge the way we have implemented aviation in the past when it comes to privacy, when it comes to security, and so forth. So I would say we as an industry, if we're not clear on what it is that we're trying to achieve, and we're not working really hard together to sort of drive toward that alignment, then those differences will work against us. But if we do know what we want, then we can operate within those differences. Europe is going to be different from the U.S. and and other CAAs around the world are going to take guidance from places that we're not even sure yet. So,
okay, let's use that response to kind of pivot into the security topic. Obviously, security, just like safety, covers a very wide range from cybersecurity to physical security. And Brian, you brought up the issue of, those of us who are working in this industry need to be very clear on where we would like to go, and working in partnership with the regulators on, is it possible to get there? And if it is, what are the guardrails and what do we need to do to actually advance in this direction? So Mike, if I could kind of toss you a pretty wide open view of, can you talk a little bit about where you see the biggest challenges? And do you feel we actually have clarity on the issues that we need to try to solve as we move forward from a security perspective into AAM?
Sure. I'll start by saying, when we started working with industry a couple of years ago now, the AAM industry, seeing that come down the road, we were looking at how drones and UAS systems kind of came so quickly. I've used the example from TSA's perspective, but I know across the federal government and state and local agencies as well, drones and UAS kind of seemed something that was an alligator miles away from the boat, and then we blinked and it was in the boat with us. So when we saw AAM coming down the road, we started working with industry early to try and get ahead of the curve and try and start answering some of these questions ahead of time, or at least table them up to know that these are things that we need to tackle and address. There's a couple different aspects, because when you look at AAM entering, and what we see is probably the early stages, right? Passenger AAM or cargo AAM in a piloted vehicle versus automated or unpiloted as you go further down the road. We initially looked to see how does that fit in the current regulatory structure. And that's what we've been working on with a lot of the OEMs and prospective operators, to say, okay, if you started business tomorrow, if you started operations tomorrow, what is it that you're looking to do? Where are you looking to go? And if you look, without getting into too much detail, if you look at TSA's security regulations, they're really based on passenger load and maximum takeoff weight of the vehicle. And that really starts at around a threshold, an MTOW of 12,500 pounds. Well, what we knew very early on in speaking with the industry and the OEMs was that all the vehicles that we were going to see initially are going to likely fall beneath that threshold. So in one aspect, you could say, well, if I start in an AAM operation tomorrow, there is the possibility, depending on the details of your operation, that you wouldn't have any interaction with TSA or regulatory requirements right off the bat. The question then becomes, well, what are your operations moving further down the road? And one of the first things that comes to mind is, if you want to bring your passengers, say, into what we would call a 1542 airport, if you look at the 49 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 1542, that's where we get into airport requirements, because you're servicing a certain type of aircraft operation where TSA performs screening. So anyone who's ever come to a typical US airport has been screened by TSA. That airport has requirements as well. So if I'm an AAM operator and I'm looking to bring passengers into Dulles Airport, for example, where do you want to bring them exactly, right? That changes some of the regulatory questions right off the bat. Are you looking to bring them to what we call the sterile side after screening, right? And intermingle your passengers with folks that have already been screened? Well, then there's certainly going to be screening requirements on the front end at the departure, if you're going to intermingle your passengers. But then the discussions come up to say, well, perhaps those won't be our initial operations. Perhaps I will bring an aircraft from Manhattan to Newark, but we won't land on the sterile side. We'll land on what we call the public side, right? And whether we come to a fixed base operator or we have an arrangement somewhere on the airport where we land on the public side, and then you enter the front door of the airport, so to speak, and you get screened with everybody else. In that example, again, you might not have immediate TSA interaction. So that has been the initial discussions with the industry, with prospective operators, is to say, okay, what is it that you're looking to do? Where are you going to start operating? The other things that come down from a security perspective, where I think, Tom, you kind of mentioned, there's parts of this where we don't know what we don't know yet, right? Certain aspects of this we haven't dealt with before. So even though TSA does not generally regulate general aviation airports per se, or other locations outside, again, what I mentioned, we would call a 1542 regulated airport. If we talk about the fact that based on their ability to avoid noise abatement issues that helicopters have previously had to deal with, are there going to be more found in an urban area where I'll see AAMs not just at a general aviation airport or on the airport tarmac, okay, traditionally, but they're on top of parking garages and city parks and things like this, things that are more regularly accessible to the public. What kind of security concerns does that bring up when we have what's called an RON, an aircraft that remains overnight? Certainly, it's obviously in the best interest for OEMs to want to protect their aircraft, and there's certain assumptions made, but there are also potential regulatory requirements that set a baseline level. Again, making the assumption that the OEM would want to protect that aircraft, of course, on their own, and perhaps exceed whatever regulatory requirements may be there and set at a base level. But these are the type of things that we're starting to look at now. And again, just the idea of perhaps lower altitude volume operations over metro areas that we really haven't seen. And I've given talks across the country about AAM, and we have occasionally made the reference to the electric helicopter. It's really no more than an electric helicopter. And in certain aspects of that conversation, you could say, yeah, that's true. And in a lot of those same aspects, TSA might not regulate those helicopters based on what I mentioned before about size and weight and passenger load. On the other hand, when we've talked about the skies are now darkening with AAM traffic, if business goes as well as everyone hopes, does that change the formula? Does that change the risk analysis based on the volume alone? Okay, and same thing with the idea of passenger cockpit security, pilot security for the vehicle itself. So these are all things that are being discussed, and there's a lot of this where we are literally working through this with the operators as we speak, waiting to see what their initial operations are going to be. But it brings in a whole lot of aspects that weren't necessarily just simply there currently based on what helicopters do today. Again, I've had talks across the country where we use the example and say, hey, wherever you are right now, especially if we're here virtually, walk outside and tell me how many helicopters you see right now. Right? For most places around the country, maybe very few, maybe none. On the other hand, again, with AAM, if the volume and the idea of being able to make this more accessible to the everyday Joe, so to speak, and now they're crisscrossing the skies, does that alone change the formula by which risk and security concerns are addressed? We think it may be. So more to follow, but I look forward to questions and more discussion. I'll pass it on to anybody else.
Okay. I guess I'll ask that we all kind of weigh in on the issue of security, and maybe I'll start us off by making a couple comments. One thing that we have heard a lot about, a lot of comments, is this idea of darkening the skies over urban areas, and that by its very definition should in fact lead to a higher bar, whether it be safety, security. And one of the things that I will say concerns us at Joby is this equating higher volume as almost by definition, meaning that the bar should be raised. When we had very few commercial operations versus, now we have commercial operations on the air transport side that are just about back to pre-pandemic levels. There's really no difference in terms of the bar that each operator needs to meet in their normal day-to-day operations. It is that immutable aspect of safety and security that Brian mentioned. So I'd hope that when we take a look at things like number of operations and certainly where those operations are makes a lot of sense to consider whether we are into a new space that requires new rules. But I'm not convinced, I'll say even personally, that volume is a huge differentiator there in terms of automatically ratcheting things up. And in fact, one of the other concerns that we have is taking that very approach says that this industry has to exceed the existing industry in terms of how we approach these topics right out of the gate, instead of just meeting what everyone else is currently meeting. So I would offer that we need to be careful heading down that path. So Brian, I'll ask you to kind of weigh in on your thoughts on the security topic and your take on what's most important here to focus on.
Yeah, and before I do that, I'll underscore what I think I just heard you say, Tom, and predominantly because how long is it going to take us to darken the skies? I think this is always about run before you walk. There's no question in my mind that things are, sort of like the rear view mirror. Things are closer than they appear. But I think we have to find our way through a process where predominantly the general public is comfortable. Otherwise, it won't make any difference. We could have, the coolest flying machines ever. If the public doesn't want them over their head, then that's it. I think that's one of the dilemmas that we need to be concerned about. So, but as I'm always wanting to emphasize, industry is about sustainability. It is about scalability, and it's not about let's see if we can push the regulators, the security experts, into doing something that they're potentially not comfortable with yet. No, we all have to get that comfort level together, and I think that's where roles that we all play separately and together are so important, where we're facilitating back and forth. On the security side, a little over a year ago, not quite a year ago, actually, we launched a cybersecurity initiative in my organization with the recognition that even though cyber is important to everybody, it's absolutely critical for things that are ultimately becoming highly automated or ultimately autonomous. So, we've had our concerns in the small UAS world with where's data going, how does that thing get controlled, et cetera, and so some of that, obviously, because of the military foundations or the defense application foundations of our organization, we knew a little bit about that. I say we in the collective. What we saw out of the blocks was for purposes of military use, we came up with Blue UAS, which was pretty stringent requirements for that had to be passed by essentially by platform providers that wanted to sell to the military. That program was being and is being administered by the Defense Innovation Unit of the DoD. And what we realized was that this was going to be a harbinger of all things unmanned, uncrewed, ultimately highly automated in all of the different domains that we were operating in. So where we are today is we have rolled out Green UAS. We've done this at a step below Blue UAS, because not everybody needs to be Blue certified if you're going to be a tool for firefighters in Kansas City, for example. But the firefighters in some of these municipal authorities, not necessarily Kansas City, wanted to see those higher levels of security met. So we started down this path first with a cyber initiative that's very, very broad, and then DIU, and we sort of found ourselves working on the same thing, wanting to be able to scale a program that we think is really, really important for not just the air, but across the scope of work that we're involved in. We're utilizing outside experts and, of course, our member experts to put together a certification process that basically has been utilized by other industries. The group in particular that we're working with worked for the utility industry, the electric utility industry in this country, which, as you know, is critical infrastructure and needed to tighten up the way it was approaching the market and some of the potential vulnerabilities that it saw. So we're leaning into this, again, not just from a safety point of view, but also from a security point of view. At the end of the day, it's not just about making people like Mike happy. It's about not just making people like Billy Nolan happy. It's about making the general public comfortable and making certain that we're executing this technology properly.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Juerg, any thoughts on the security topic?
Yeah, I definitely have a few thoughts. First thing, we have it slightly easier because we're fixing airplanes, flying in existing airports, existing routes, existing operation. So there we actually applaud the leadership of the TSA. They have done a lot of good work there. We have a 135 operator, and as Mike just mentioned, is while it's only above the threshold 12,500, the TSA actually is a program for that 12.5 program that 135 operators can get into it to be able to get availability of the security threats, to be able to do information sharing. So we're actually working with the TSA on how we get into this program. They have reached out to us, we have reached out to them of how we collaborate. I think their information sharing is one of the key aspects. Like knowing as an operator of an airline what the threats are is the key piece. What do I need to protect myself of? What information can I give to the TSA of what we're seeing on our side? They want to know how we operate because we're a 135 operator, which is in smaller airports. We fly in one big airport and then we have the outstations there. So it's definitely the regional air mobility, folding that into more of a structured process that the TSA has laid out, and the Department of Homeland Security. So the leadership there is definitely very much appreciated. Probably the other piece I want to add on the security side, so there's the operational side. I think the TSA has a really good handle on that part. And then there's the airborne hardware or the airborne aircraft side, like how do we ensure airworthiness? And similarly there, I think we're very much in favor of deploying well understood standards. Like NIST has done a lot for the industry of standards that we protect systems against it. They have thought through that at length, how the defense in depth works, how we do the threat analysis. And I think there's, as an aerospace industry, we can leverage from neighboring industries that have been dealing with that quite a bit longer. The challenge we've seen on the cybersecurity side is that the threats change quicker. On the safety side, it's an airframe that doesn't change that much, and the safety can be assured. Versus on the security side, suddenly new vulnerabilities might come that we need to respond to. And having processes in place that lets you make changes as the security threats come up, and using some of the existing processes of assessing that and having a defense in depth, like if we have more protection layers in there, but one of them has been compromised. And how do we roll this out into an updated airframe to continuously protect it? So there's definitely a lot of good work there going on, and I would encourage that the aerospace industry also looks at the neighboring industries that have been doing this for a long time ahead of us.
I completely agree with that. There really is a tendency to think, oh, everything's new, and again, you just don't want to deal with the existing rules. And that is not the fastest way to market. That's not the fastest way to realize what we're all trying to achieve, which is to bring this technology forward and get it in place quickly. And that means adhering to the Part 135 rules, living within the security constructs that have been built up over time and have proven themselves. I'll use that, I guess, as a bit of a segue into some of the questions we've been getting in. We've had two questions come up that have mentioned safety management systems, one pointing out very directly that none of the panelists had mentioned SMS. I will say that I can say that Joby is pursuing an SMS across all of their elements of the company. And I do feel that it is something that certainly the larger players in AAM should be participating in. SMS has proven itself over time to really lead to safety improvements. Would any of the panelists like to say a bit more about SMS?
I can add on the same comment. As a 135 operator, it's the same piece. We're working on the SMS, get that activated. Our airline has been flying. It's been built up over the last 6 to 9 months. and that's the next logical step. So our president is actually actively working this as a project and activating an SMS. Agree with the same sentiment. It's a well-established framework that increases the safety of the operation.
I completely agree. I didn't bring it up simply, see my earlier comment about we're adding on safety, but that doesn't mean we're trying to reinvent it either. By all means, you know, we're all still aviators and we're going to utilize what works.
So for Mike, did you have anything to add on SMS? Or?
No, that would actually be out of my wheelhouse.
Okay, fair enough. For something a little bit different, one of the very first questions that we got noted, see the biggest issue in getting communities to allow vertiports, kind of getting to your point, Brian, of, you know, people have to be willing to actually accept this technology. So getting communities to allow vertiports in large cities, investing in infrastructure to support the vertiports, you know, what does this panel think is the how that's going to unfold? And I'm going to spin it a little bit to say, what are the considerations for safety and security for vertiports? Mike, you mentioned you know, operators wanting to land, say, on the sterile side of an airport where everyone's been vetted through security. I know our overall plan is to start not doing that, to fly from GA airports to GA airports. And if you need to do a multimodal transition to a long haul route, then you would still process through security. But any thoughts you'd like to say about what you're looking at from vertiport perspective?
Sure. I mentioned earlier that you know, the airport and vertiport brings a whole other aspect of security outside the aircraft. When you're talking about the aircraft that's going to remain there overnight or sit there for any length of time, what kind of physical security requirements do we have or will we have for that? Again, there's always been an assumed level of security, even in general aviation settings, where TSA might not set physical security requirements as we do with, as I mentioned, 1542 airports. But this kind of goes back to what we were talking about a little bit with volume, because I agree with you, Tom. You know, the idea of the skies darkening should not change the level of security, because one should be as important as 100, right? And everything we do for that one, we should do for 100. But where we see volume kind of come into play, and this may work out along with this conversation on airports and vertiports, is, and by the way, these concerns have been brought to us by some of the OEMs and the prospective airport operators and vertiport operators. The idea that those services exist today, right? When we talk about what an OEM or an operator's business plan may be, especially in the early stages of bringing you from Manhattan to Newark, right, to get on your international flight. That exists today in executive helicopter services, okay? And nobody's banging our doors down from a security concern or talking about passenger screening. There's very low requirements based on what we talked about earlier on aircraft weight thresholds, okay? However, back to that volume situation, if now this service is much, much more in public awareness, okay? When public awareness goes up, general awareness goes up, and you worry about the bad guy. And what have they learned about this potential new target? So when I talk about volume, it's kind of along those lines as well. Is again, a lot of these services already exist today, but they're very low volume, okay, compared to what we may see with AAM. And again, if AAM is successful as everyone hopes, it's that volume, but with volume comes public awareness. So whether we're talking about, again, the aircraft security itself or the physical security of those airports, the vertiports, to your point, you know, what are civilians who live in the area, citizens who live in that area are going to be concerned with, okay, just based on the foot traffic. That comes up when you think about it, when a new train station, I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, right? A new metro station gets put into a certain area of the city, whether that's Maryland, Virginia, D.C., and local residents may have concern about the crime that comes with it. It's not all about terrorism necessarily, just the foot traffic, the awareness, the number of people that are coming and going. So that's all an aspect of security that we have to look at as these things come forward.
Excellent. Brian or Juerg, anything to add?
Fix the airplane, fix the airports.
Yep. That is certainly a mantra that we have kept to at Joby. The closer we are to what's already out there at entry into service, the faster we can get flying and bring this to reality. And that is one thing that I would definitely like to leave the audience with today out of this particular webinar is this stuff is coming and it's coming fast. I know we like to think about autonomy, and there were a couple questions that we didn't get to that we're talking about. You know, what are ultimately going to be the impacts of autonomy, and if we're not autonomous right from the start, where are the pilots coming from? These are real problems and challenges that we need to work through. I know at Joby we are working hard to create pipelines for pilots to fly our fleet, but we have opted to start piloted very specifically because we want as early entry into the airspace as possible. And then over the long haul, back to something that Brian said, this idea of crawl, walk, run, autonomy will come, but it will come as we solve the challenges of moving from automation to autonomous. There's a lot of steps along that path. We're coming up to the end of our time. I think it's probably time for me to toss it back over to Terry for a few last remarks.
So Tom, Brian, Juerg, and Michael, thank you for being with us today and for taking the time out of your busy schedules to share some of your insights with the audience. It was another great discussion. I know all of us appreciate their valuable participation in the discussion this afternoon. For the audience, thank you for joining us today. I hope you found today's presentations educational, inspiring, and evolving. And again, these webinars are being recorded, so if you want to review anything presented today or any of our past webinars, you can do so by going to the RTCA YouTube channel. The ability to bring us these webinars, again, would not be possible without the support of several of our members. And so I'm very pleased to thank our gold sponsors for the webinars, Collins Aerospace, and the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, as well as to Gamma, sponsor of today's webinar. We all appreciate their support of RTCA and for this webinar series, so thank you. Again, want to remind you about our upcoming RTCA training courses we have coming up in June on DO 178C, Human Factors, and the Airworthiness Security Certification course. And again, if you're interested, you can register for those courses at our website at www.rtca.org. Now, I mentioned earlier, this is the second in our series of the 3 webinars on advanced air mobility. The third of this series are going to be held next month on May 24th, starting at 1:00 p.m. We'll have another set of experts in this field discussing AAM concepts of operations. And in addition to these webinars, as I mentioned in my opening comments, we've been hosting some AAM workshops in our offices that have included participants from manufacturers, equipment providers, operator industry associations, and the FAA. If you're interested in seeing a summary of those discussions, are posted in the news section of our website, again, at www.rtca.org. Next month, on May 10th, you're going to find us in Denver at AUVSI's Exponential event, where we'll be holding another workshop on how safety and the role of safety standards and safety management systems are going to be so important in the successful implementation of AAM in the future. Our workshop is scheduled on that Wednesday, starting at 10:30 a.m. Again, to the audience, thank you for taking the time to be with us and making RTC a part of your day. Have a pleasant, safe remainder of your afternoon. Thank you.